The ink was still wet on her father's signature the morning they put Verity Hale on a wagon headed for the Ochoco Basin. She was 22 years old. She had a flour sack with 3 dresses, a bone-handled hairbrush, and a tin of her mother's dried lavender that she kept not for the smell but because it was the only thing left that still held the shape of her mother's hands. The man holding the reins didn't look at her. He looked at his horses. He had paid $140 and a canceled promissory note for the privilege of her company, and he seemed no more moved by the transaction than if he'd purchased a second-hand plow. His name was Corbin Strand. He was 38 years old, a cattle rancher working a hard stretch of high desert land east of the Crooked River. His wife had died 14 months earlier during a breech birth that took the baby with her. He had 4 children ranging in age from 6 to 15, and according to the county clerk who processed the arrangement, he had not set foot inside the town of Ridgefall since the burial. Verity had heard the rumors before she ever saw his face, that he'd gone feral up there, that the children ran loose like jackrabbits, that the eldest boy had threatened a supply driver with a skinning knife last September over a short delivery of flour. She had not cried when her father pressed his thumb to the paper. Crying required the belief that something could be undone. This couldn't. The road east from Ridgefall was not a road so much as a suggestion of 1 twin-wheel ruts worn into the basalt and sage, climbing steadily toward the gray line of rimrock that cut the horizon like a scar. The wagon seat was bare hardwood, and every stone the wheels found sent a jolt up Verity's spine. She sat with her flour sack in her lap and her hands folded on top of it, and watched the scrubby juniper trees thin out as the elevation dropped into the basin. Corbin hadn't spoken since they left the feed store where the paperwork was signed. She decided to test the silence. "How far?" "4 hours," he said. "The children know I'm coming." A pause. "They know." And he shifted the reins from one hand to the other. The leather creaked. "Rosalind's the oldest. 15. She's been running the house since February. She won't be glad to see you." He said it plainly, the way a man reports weather. "The boys will follow her lead. Emmett's 12, Dutch is 9. The little one's 6. Her name is Fern." Verity looked at the side of his face. The jaw was square and sunburned, the mouth bracketed by deep lines that came from years of squinting into high desert glare, not from smiling. There was a long, pale scar running from his left ear down toward the collar of his coat, old, healed smooth, probably from before the children were born. "And you?" Verity asked. "Will you be glad to see me?" He looked at her then. Just for a moment. His eyes were the particular gray-brown of river silt, and they held no warmth and no hostility, only an exhausted, grinding practicality. "I need someone who can keep the stove going and mind Fern when I'm out on the range. That's what I need." He turned back to the horses. "What I'm glad about's got nothing to do with it." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in months. She faced forward and said nothing else. The basin opened up below them as they came over the last rise, and Verity's first thought was that it was the most desolate place she had ever seen. The land was vast and brown and broken, cut through by the glittering thread of the river and ringed on 3 sides by walls of rimrock that caught the afternoon light and turned it amber. The ranch was a low cluster of dark buildings in the center of it all. A log house, a long barn, a scattering of outbuildings leaning at various angles like old men in wind. She could see, even from that distance, that the fence posts along the south pasture were down. She could see the kitchen garden had gone to thistle. She could see a child standing on the roof of the barn. "Is that normal?" Verity said. Corbin looked. His jaw tightened. "Dutch," he said, as if that explained it. They pulled into the yard and the dogs came first. 3 of them, large and loud and suspicious, circling the wagon wheels in a frenzy of barking. Then the children emerged from the house in a loose cluster, and Verity had a sudden, visceral understanding of what Corbin had meant by feral. Rosalind was tall for 15, with her father's square jaw and her mother's dark hair, which she wore in a single braid that had not been touched by a brush in what appeared to be several weeks. She stood on the porch with her arms crossed and her feet planted shoulder-width apart, and she looked at Verity the way a rancher looks at a suspicious cloud on the horizon. Not afraid, just calculating the damage. Emmett stood half a step behind his sister, holding a rusted hatchet casually at his side. Not threatening, just present. Dutch had climbed down from the barn roof by this point and was approaching the wagon from the side, his boots unlaced and trailing, his face smeared with what Verity hoped was mud. Fern was nowhere visible. Corbin set the brake and stepped down from the wagon without ceremony. "Rosalind," he said, "this is Verity Hale. She'll be staying." Rosalind's eyes moved over Verity with the slow deliberateness of a land survey. She said nothing. "Where's Fern?" Corbin asked. "Under the porch," Emmett said. "She's been there since noon." Corbin exhaled through his nose and went around the side of the house without further comment. Verity climbed down from the wagon herself, her legs stiff and her lower back aching from the bench seat. She picked up her flour sack and walked toward the porch. Rosalind stepped 1 inch to the right, just enough to let her pass, not enough to be called welcome. The smell of the interior hit her before her eyes adjusted to the dim. It was the smell of a house that had been managed by children for too long: sour milk, burned fat, wet dog, and underneath everything, the particular sadness of a hearth that had gone cold in the night more than once that winter and hadn't been properly aired since. The floor was rough-cut pine plank, covered in a layer of tracked-in grit. The table held the remains of what appeared to be 3 different meals, none of them cleared. A pair of Emmett's boots sat in the middle of the floor for no evident reason. The curtains on the single east window were torn at the rod and hung at an angle, letting in a thin stripe of late light that illuminated the dust. Verity stood in the center of the room. She was 22 years old. She had been paid for like livestock. She was standing in a stranger's filth with a flour sack over her shoulder and 4 hostile children arranged around her like a jury. And the man who had purchased her company had already walked away to extract the youngest from under the porch. The panic came, as it always did, a cold flutter behind her breastbone, a tightening in her throat, the body's primitive insistence that this was not survivable. She let it move through her. She did not let it move her. She set her flour sack on a chair. She found an apron on a nail by the door and put it on. She said to the room at large, "Someone show me where the water barrel is." Nobody moved. "I'll find it myself," she said, and went to look. The first week was not an adjustment. It was a siege. Corbin was gone before first light each morning, riding out with one of the ranch hands to work the cattle that ranged across the upper basin. He came in after dark, ate whatever was on the table, and went to the small room off the back of the kitchen, where he slept. He spoke to Verity in the functional, abbreviated sentences of a man accustomed to giving orders to people who already understood the context. He never raised his voice. He never acknowledged that anything she was doing was difficult. He simply assumed it would be done. The children were a different variety of opposition. Rosalind ran a counter-operation with the systematic efficiency of a general who had been studying the terrain for months. She didn't openly defy Verity. She simply unmade everything Verity did, one quiet step behind her. Verity would sweep the floor. Rosalind would send Dutch in with his boots. Verity would get the stove hot and the bread rising. Rosalind would let the fire die down at exactly the wrong hour, so the loaves came out dense in the center. Verity would mend the curtain. The next morning it would be torn again at a different seam, and no one would have seen anything. Emmett communicated primarily in monosyllables and the strategic placement of sharp tools in places Verity was likely to step. Dutch was chaos in boot leather and couldn't be held responsible for anything in particular, because he was always in the process of destroying something several acres away. Fern said nothing at all. She was 6 years old and small for it, with the kind of watchful silence that in an adult would be called wariness, and in a child is called something that keeps you awake at night. She ate what was put in front of her. She slept when she was told. She followed Rosalind like a shadow and watched Verity from a careful distance, as if Verity were a weather system that had not yet declared its full intentions. By the 5th day, Verity's hands were cracked from the cold water and the harsh lye soap. The skin at her knuckles had split in 2 places and bled when she made a fist. She had hauled water from the pump 40 feet from the house every morning since she arrived. She had rebuilt the kitchen garden fence using posts she cut herself from the woodpile, because no one offered to help. She had killed and dressed 2 chickens and rendered the fat and used it to make proper biscuits, which Dutch ate 6 of, and then denied knowing anything about who had eaten them. She had not slept more than 5 hours in any given night, and she had not broken. The breaking point came when it came over a clean shirt. She had spent an afternoon washing the children's clothes, boiling them in the big cast-iron kettle in the yard, scrubbing them on the ribbed board until her shoulders screamed, wringing them out and hanging them on the fence line to dry in the thin autumn sun. It took 4 hours. When she brought them in and folded them and placed them on the table, Rosalind walked over, picked up her own clean blouse, looked at it for a moment, and dropped it deliberately in the dirt beside the table. "I wash my own clothes," Rosalind said. She didn't say it with heat. She said it with the flat, declarative certainty of someone stating property lines. Verity looked at the blouse in the dirt. She looked at the 4 hours of work it represented. She looked at Rosalind's face, which was composed in the particular expression of a teenager who has decided she is not going to feel bad about this and is daring the world to make her. Verity picked up the blouse. She turned it over in her hands. She set it on the table, smoothed it flat with her palm, and looked at Rosalind straight. "Your mother taught you to wash your own clothes," Verity said. Rosalind's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. A fractional, involuntary flinch, the kind that happens before the person can stop it. "Good," Verity said. "Then you know how. Yours are done separate from now on. I won't touch them." She picked up the rest of the folded clothes and walked away. That night, after the children were in the loft and the fire was low, Corbin came in late from a ride up to the north fence. He sat at the table and pulled off his boots and said nothing for a long while. Verity was mending by the lamp. The silence between them had developed, over the week, a kind of texture, not comfortable, but not hostile either. More like 2 people sharing a waiting room. "She put the blouse in the dirt," Corbin said. Verity looked up. "You heard about that. Emmett told Dutch told Fern, and Fern doesn't know how to keep secrets." He looked at the fire. "What did you say to her?" "I told her she could wash her own." He was quiet for a moment. "That's all. That's all." He nodded slowly, working at a knot in his bootlace. "You didn't try to make her feel sorry about it?" "No." "Why not?" "Because she's not sorry," Verity said, pulling the thread taut. "She's 15, and she's angry, and she's been holding this house together with wire and spite since her mother died. She doesn't need me to make her feel small. She needs to know I'm not trying to take anything from her." Corbin stopped working at the bootlace. He looked at her then, directly, with the same unguarded assessment she had sometimes caught when he thought she wasn't watching. "She had to grow up too fast," he said. "Yes," Verity said. "So did I." The fire shifted. A log settled, throwing a brief flash of light. Corbin looked back at the floor. "You're harder than I expected," he said, and it was clearly meant as a compliment. "Most people are," Verity replied, and went back to her mending. The illness came in November, on a Thursday, without preamble. Corbin had ridden out 2 days before with the ranch hand, Aldridge, to move the remaining cattle down from the high summer pasture before the first real snow locked the passes. He expected to be gone 4 days. Verity had not been alone with the children for longer than an afternoon before. She was banking the stove coals before bed when she heard the sound from the loft, a rapid, shallow breathing, not the breathing of a sleeping child. She stood still and listened. Then she climbed the narrow stairs. Fern was on her side in the narrow bed she shared with Rosalind, her face turned toward the wall. The child's small chest was working too hard, the ribs visible against her nightgown with each labored intake. When Verity put her hand to Fern's forehead, the heat was like touching a stovepipe. Rosalind was awake. She was already sitting up, her braid loose, her face stripped of its usual composure. She was watching Fern breathe with the focused intensity of someone keeping watch at a deathbed, and Verity understood immediately that this had happened before, or something close enough to it that Rosalind recognized what it meant. "How long?" Verity asked. "Since supper," Rosalind said. Her voice was careful and controlled. "She said she was cold. I thought she was just cold." "She's not just cold." Verity lifted Fern and the child didn't resist, just curled into her, heavy and burning. "Get down and get the fire up, hot as it'll go." "I need the kettle on, and I need every spare blanket you have." For a moment Rosalind didn't move. She sat in the dim loft, looking at her little sister in Verity's arms, with an expression that was frightened and 6 years old and completely at odds with everything she had spent the last week carefully projecting. "Rosalind." Verity's voice was quiet. "I need you now." Rosalind moved. What followed was not a night. It was a sustained act of will stretched across hours that didn't seem to end. Verity worked the sick child the way she had watched her mother work, a fire that was threatening to go out, not with panic, with patience and precision. She steamed Fern's lungs with a tent of wool blankets over a kettle of water, thick with dried pine needles and the last of a tin of camphor she found in the bottom of the medicine shelf. She dosed her with willow bark tea that she ground herself and sweetened with the heel of a molasses jar. Every hour on the hour, she changed the cloth on Fern's forehead. Every time the child tried to stop fighting, Verity brought her back, with voice, with touch, with the particular stubborn insistence of a person who has decided that this particular outcome is not acceptable. Emmett stayed awake without being asked. He kept the fire going, hauling wood from the porch in the dark in his nightshirt, without complaint, his face set in the grim, efficient expression of a 12-year-old boy who has decided to be useful. Dutch was sent to his bed at midnight and actually went, which was a different variety of miracle. Rosalind sat at the foot of the bed and didn't leave. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, the tension in Fern's small chest began, slowly, to ease. The breathing evened out. The skin still burned, but the frantic, desperate quality of it changed, from fever fighting to fever breaking, which are two entirely different things, and Verity knew the difference. She sat back in the chair she had pulled to the bedside and let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs. Rosalind, from the foot of the bed, said quietly, "How did you know what to do?" Verity looked at her hands. They were trembling faintly. "My younger brother," she said. "Twice before he was 8. You learn." Rosalind looked at Fern's face, still flushed but breathing steadily. "She looks like my mother when she sleeps," she said. She didn't say it to Verity exactly. She just said it into the dim room. Everyone always said so. Verity didn't answer. Some things don't need a response. They just need to be heard by someone who won't flinch. They sat together in the quiet until Fern's breathing became the deep, even rhythm of genuine sleep. Then Rosalind stood, straightened her nightgown, with the particular dignity of someone who has been seen in a vulnerable moment and intends to proceed as if that is fine, and said, "I'll take the next watch. You should sleep." It was the first thing Rosalind had said to her that wasn't a boundary or a warning. Verity went downstairs and lay down on her pallet and was asleep in 3 minutes. Corbin came home on the 5th day instead of the 4th, which meant Aldridge had pushed them hard on the return. He came through the door with the cold still on him and the barn smell of horses and wood smoke, and he stopped when he saw the arrangement of the room, the camphor tin on the table, the excess blankets draped over the chair, the general evidence of a house that had been in emergency mode and was now in recovery. Verity was at the stove. She heard the pause in his step and turned. "Fern," she said, before he could speak. "She had a lung fever. She's all right. It broke 2 nights ago." She paused. It was close for a few hours. She watched him process this, watched the information travel through his face in a way that he didn't try to control, because he wasn't expecting to have to. The jaw went rigid. The eyes went somewhere she wasn't sure she was supposed to see. "Where is she now?" he said. "Napping. She's been up and eating since yesterday morning. She's all right, Corbin." He stood in the center of the room with his hat in his hands for a long moment. Then he looked at Verity, not the functional, assessing look he had developed for the logistics of daily life. Something else, something that took in the shadows under her eyes and the tremor she hadn't been able to entirely shake from her left hand, and the fact that she was still upright and had not, apparently, allowed his youngest daughter to die. He set his hat on the table. He walked to the stove, which is where Verity was standing, and he poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot that was always on. His arm was close to hers in the small space. He didn't move away. "Tell me what happened," he said. She told him, all of it. The breathing she heard from the loft, the camphor tent, the willow bark, the hours. She told it plainly, in sequence, because that was how she processed things. When she finished, he was looking at his coffee cup. "Rosalind stayed up with you," he said. "All night. Both nights." He was quiet for a moment. "She never did that for me," he said. "When things got hard after her mother went, she just closed up. I didn't know how to get through to her." "She wasn't closing up from you," Verity said carefully. "She was holding herself together so you didn't have to worry about her." Corbin looked at her. "She's been trying to be enough," Verity said. "For the younger ones, for you, for the house. That's a hebble thing for 15. He was still looking at her. After a moment he said, "You figured that out in a week." "I was her," Verity said simply, "before this." The fire in the stove ticked softly. Outside, across the yard, she could hear Dutch hollering something at the dogs, normal, daily, blessedly ordinary. Corbin set his coffee cup down. He reached out and, without any particular ceremony, covered her left hand with his. His hand was large and roughened and warm, and it stopped the trembling she hadn't been able to control since the worst of Fern's fever. He didn't say anything. He just held it still for a moment, the way you hold a door shut against a wind that's trying to blow it open. Then he picked up his coffee and went to find his daughter. Spring thaw in the Ochoko Basin came late and mean, with 3 days of warm rain that turned the ranch yard into a shoe-eating bog before the sun came back out and the ground hardened up. Verity planted the kitchen garden herself, kneeling in the cold mud with seeds she had ordered from the catalog. Corbin let her add to the winter supply list without comment. Rosalind knelt beside her on the second morning, uninvited, and planted the second row. They didn't discuss it. They just did it together. The trip to Ridgefall happened in April, when the road was dry enough for the wagon. Corbin needed to settle an account at the feed merchant and pick up the salt order. Rosalind asked to come. Then Emmett. Then, inevitably, Dutch and Fern, because neither could bear to be left behind once the others were going. Verity stood in the yard and looked at the fully loaded wagon and thought about what it meant to go back into that town. She had left Ridgefall as a transaction, an entry in a ledger, a number written next to her father's name. She climbed up onto the buckboard. Corbin got up beside her. The reins went taut, and the horses moved forward, and the ranch shrank behind them. Ridgefall was a stage town on the freight road, 2 streets of whitewashed storefronts, and a hotel with a tilted sign. As the wagon came down the main road, Verity was aware of the particular quality of attention that a small town directs at the unexpected. The way conversations pause, the way sweeping stops, the way even the dogs seem to take stock. They had expected something broken to come back down out of that basin. Instead, here was a wagon with 5 people on it, and all of them alive and none of them visibly damaged. Corbin pulled up in front of the feed merchant and set the brake. He stepped down and turned and offered Verity his hand. She took it, not because she needed it to step down, but because she understood what it meant to take it, that it wasn't charity or performance, but the ordinary gesture of a man who had decided that this is how it is now. She stepped down into the street. Her boots were her own, the same heavy leather pair she'd worn up to the basin, now cracked and resoled once by her own hand with a needle and wax thread. Her coat was new. Corbin had ordered it from the catalog when the temperatures dropped in December, saying only that the one she had wasn't enough for the Basin winters. It fit. She hadn't thanked him, and he hadn't expected her to. Rosalind jumped down from the wagon bed and landed in the mud beside Verity. She straightened up and looked at the town with the frank, unimpressed assessment of someone who has been doing harder things than this all winter. "Feed merchant first," Rosalind said. "Then I want to look at the dry goods." Verity looked at her. At the braid that was neat and pinned, because Verity had shown her a better way to manage it 2 months ago, and Rosalind had accepted the information without comment and applied it ever since. At the jaw that was her father's jaw and the eyes that were her mother's, probably because they were too dark and too watchful to belong to someone as straightforward as Corbin. "Feed merchant first," Verity agreed. The interior of the feed merchant was dim and warm and smelled of grain dust and leather. The merchant, a heavy-set man named Pruitt, looked up from his scale when the door opened. He looked at Corbin. He looked at Verity. He had the particular expression of a man recalculating something he thought he had already figured out. "Strand," he said. "Good to see you down out of the basin. We weren't—" He stopped. "It's a hard winter up there. We didn't know if—" 200 pounds of oats, Verity said. 50 of barley. He'll need the salt order, too. It should be in the back. It was called in by letter in February." Pruitt blinked at her. Corbin stood just inside the door, his arms crossed, and said nothing. "She's right," Corbin said. "Get the salt." Pruitt went to get the salt. Verity walked to the counter and checked the price list posted on the board above the register. Habit now, and found 2 items overcharged from the prior order. She noted them on the back of the supply list she carried in her coat pocket, the one she wrote every week in the even, slanted handwriting she'd had since she was 12. When Pruitt came back, she pointed to the discrepancies without heat or accusation, simply as facts. Pruitt adjusted the figures. He did it without arguing. Outside, on the boardwalk, Dutch was trying to convince a stranger's horse that it wanted to be his friend, and Emmett was watching with the expression of a boy who expects to be embarrassed in approximately 30 seconds but isn't prepared to do anything about it. Fern had found a cat under the boardwalk and was crouched in the mud talking to it seriously through the gap in the planks. This was the family. Ridiculous and loud and difficult and entirely, improbably hers. Corbin came out of the merchant behind her and stood on the boardwalk, looking at his children with the particular expression he wore when he didn't have the words for something and wasn't going to look for them. Then he looked at Verity, who was putting the supply list back in her coat pocket. "You caught the overcharge," he said. "He does it to everyone," Verity said. "He just expects most people won't notice." Corbin almost smiled. It happened sometimes now, not a full smile, which seemed to be something he kept for very private moments, but the suggestion of one, the corners of his eyes going fractionally soft. "You're going to terrify every merchant between here and the river before summer." "Good," Verity said. "They should be paying attention." He made a sound that in a less restrained man would have been a laugh. He picked up Dutch by the collar before the horse situation could escalate, handed Fern the cat temporarily so she could be extracted from the mud, and herded the children back toward the wagon. Verity stood for a moment on the boardwalk. A woman she didn't know was watching from across the street. Middle-aged, respectable coat, the kind of expression that meant she had been in Ridgefall long enough to know what Verity was and where she'd come from, and had made certain assumptions about how it would go. Verity looked back at her, calm and steady and without apology. Then she turned and walked to the wagon. The ride back into the basin was long, and the afternoon light went gold and then amber across the rimrock, and the sage came alive in that particular evening smell that Verity had come to recognize as the signal for day ending and fire starting, and the particular accounting of what had been managed and what remained. She had come to love that smell in a way she hadn't expected, the same way she hadn't expected any of this. Not the grinding difficulty of it, not the way Fern had started sitting next to her at meals, not the way Rosalind now asked her questions with the careful, sideways approach of someone who wants information but hasn't decided yet to admit she wants it. Corbin drove. The horses knew the road. Dutch was asleep in the wagon bed within the first mile, his head on Emmett's leg, his boots leaving mud on the side rails. Fern had Rosalind's braid in her fingers, working it loose in the way 6-year-olds do without any awareness that they're doing it, and Rosalind let her. The ranch came into view below them as they crested the last rise, the dark cluster of buildings against the pale basin floor, the lamp in the kitchen window that Emmett had apparently left burning, which he would hear about. It wasn't a home she had chosen. It was a home she had built out of what was given, with the tools she had, and the people who had been there when she arrived, and the months of work that had no audience and required no audience because it was not a performance. It was hers. Corbin glanced at her as they started down the slope, not a long look. Just a moment of taking account, the way he looked at the fence line every morning to see what the night had done to it. "You all right?" he said. She thought about the question. It wasn't a small question, even though it was a small number of words. "Yes," she said. She meant it. He nodded once, and they drove the rest of the way home in the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled.